soon. You have awakened me too soon, Executus.
You are not prepared.
You face Jaraxxus, Eridar Lord of the Burning Legion.
Run away, little girl. Run away.
Your friends, your actions are illogical. All possible results for this encounter have been calculated. The Pantheon received.
When World of Warcraft dropped in 2004, Blizzard had no idea what they had just unleashed, a game that would shape the lives of many, create lifetime fans, and expand a fantasy world over the space of nearly 2 decades. And a favourite pastime in the game for many has not been so much engaging in the war in Warcraft, it's been the PvE, dungeons, raids, gear chasing, the feeling of knowing that you can be the best in the world. Whether it was all for standing next to the mailbox in Ironforge in your full tier 2, being the first to own a legendary item, or just the bragging rights, you give a people a mountain and they will climb it. So I thought, why not cover it, as in pretty much all of it. That is raiding competitively, from the time it was napkin maths and playing on a CRT monitor, all the way to having esport teams where they hire experts to analyze logs and create their own custom weak auras. Throughout this, I'm going to try and focus on the big events that shape raiding, led to the rise and fall of famous guilds, and just how much things have changed over the years. Also, for the sake of the video not being excessively long, I'll be focusing on the hardest or largest raid clears, so no 10-man content, no covering multiple difficulties of the same tier. I've no doubt I'm going to miss out quite a few bits, but I hope to bring out the most interesting points from the race historically. I suppose we better make a start then. Vanilla, as in 2004 vanilla, not 2019 classic. Big difference there. You could drop aggro in raids by running far away enough from a boss, and chances are if a boss seemed too mathematically difficult, there may be a way to bug it out in one way or another. It was a real trial by fire at the time. Well, quite literally, the first 2 end bosses of World of Warcraft were Onyxia and Ragnaros, and, well, you can imagine how long it took for people to both work out exactly how to get into Onyxia's lair. It's even a totally different quest between the Horde and Alliance, and for Ragnaros, though you can just go into Molten Core, after attuning of course and starting to kill bosses, you need dowses, which of course means you have to have done the quest line and gotten the rep from an NPC who seems to have been placed deliberately in the most inconvenient possible location. I mean, come on, nobody wants to go to Ashara. It was definitely a simpler time, one that a lot of players look back to fondly, yet in these early days there were absolutely still those pushing for the world first clears and to perform as best as they could despite the minimal tools at their disposal. Onyxia lived for 69 days before being taken down, and Ragnaros in vanilla to this day is the boss that has taken the longest to kill, chilling in his lava pool for 154 days before being rudely awakened. Too soon, if you ask me. US Guild Ascent grabbed the first kill on the 25th of April 2005, on Horde, interestingly enough. If we have seen one change on Classic, it's how many top-end players choose to go Alliance for the PvE benefits nowadays. Classic's next raid in 1.6 was Blackwing Lair, where the boss Nefarian resided, releasing July 15th, 2005. Ascent were once again leading the race early, taking down Razorgore and Vale on the same day of release. The Lord of Blackrock Mountain took some time longer though, a total of 77 days before the guild drama landed the world first with a rather snappy 22-minute kill. Patch 1.9 saw the legendary war effort and some proper world first raiding drama. This came in the form of the last boss and some of the optional bosses, but mainly the last boss. Cthulhu. The Cthulhu on his release was historically named the mathematically impossible boss, both with video footage and a post made by Ian Hazzikostas himself, where he says basically anything you might think, it's been tried. After a couple of weeks of beating our heads against Phase 2 head-on, we came to the conclusion there had to be some gimmick because the fight was impossible otherwise. The level of difficulty was such that, in an unprecedented move, members of very well-known guilds at the time, such as Elitist Jerks, Death and Taxes, Afterlight, Ascent, Immortality, and others began to publicly discuss Cthulhu's strategies after 1.5 months of futile attempts on said boss. And it's important to remark that for the vast majority of World First races, that each and every guild was very much their own self-contained unit working solely towards getting the World First kill. There were no streams, no guides, no YouTube videos, no cross-guild discussions, and for the early days, no PTR testing. Over time, the race has become very heavily publicized, and much more of it is already known in advance. In time though, it turned out Cthulhu was just kind of buggy. Tentacles spawning in the stomach led to unavoidable death, getting knocked out of bounds, and so many other issues led to frustrations in the World First race for this boss. Eventually, the content was nerfed or fixed, pick whichever you will, and Nihilum grabbed the first ever World First for Europe. The old god's reign on Azeroth lasted 113 days from his release, though not without a second wave of drama, and this would become a recurring event for Nihilum in their pursuit to gain World First. You see, one particular battle pet, the Disgusting Oozling, applied a buff to you when summoned, and back then both bosses and players had debuff and buff limits. Summoning and dismissing the pet in rapid succession would repeatedly apply a debuff to the player. 16 debuffs was enough to push off any negative debuffs that were applied during the Cthulhu fight, designed to make it more difficult. This was the first of many World Firsts for Nihilum. Patch 1.11 saw the last 40-man raid ever in World of Warcraft, and an instance that was so difficult it's rumoured as little as 0.1% of the player base cleared it back in 2006. I'm of course talking about the floating necropolis, the Dread Citadel, Naxxramas, a gigantic 15-boss mega raid to end off World of Warcraft's debut on the mmorpg scene. This was a time when guilds couldn't save progress from last week. Every boss must be defeated in one reset, and though many looked to the end boss for the World First, the biggest and most challenging hurdle to overcome was the 4 Horsemen encounter, a fight that suddenly required your guild to have 8 tanks. 8 very geared tanks, might I add, and catch-up gear wasn't really a thing at the time either. Then beyond that lay the hardest resistance-based encounter ever, Sapphiron, but eventually it was Europe again that took the crown. Nihilum scored their second World First on the 7th of September 2006, securing their place as raiding legends. Vanilla though really was still the early days. During TBC and Wrath the Lich King, organisations would start forming, sponsors would begin to get involved, and top guild names and players started to be talked about by the wider community. Esports and broadcasting became more commonplace, and players began to show their skills not only on YouTube, but on the likes of Justin TV, which would later become Twitch. This was a massive time of growth for World of Warcraft as a game, and along with it, guilds that have gone down in the history books of raiding rose and fell. Through the Dark Portal into World of Warcraft's first expansion would see no shortage of memorable raids and encounters for both the right and the wrong reasons. Near the entirety of the Burning Crusade would be marked as a period of dominance for the European guild that rose to prominence during vanilla Nihilum, and TBC would launch in 2007 with a huge amount of content for the competitive player. Gruul's Lair, Magtheridon's Lair, Serpent Shrine Cavern, Tempest Keep, Karazhan, and technically Mount Hyjal, all of which were of course behind the walls of attunements. By this point, raiding had been cut down from 40 to 25 players, distilling guilds down to only the best of the best. Gruul, a boss that would make a reappearance in a later expansion, will live for 19 days total, and Magtheridon for 40 days from expansion launch. Both kills were again claimed by Nihilum. Tier 5 though was about to be a rude awakening for even the best guilds. The two end bosses, Lady Vash and Kael'thas, were not just only a little bit harder than anything in TBC, they were massively harder, and yet it was Nihilum that once again claimed both world firsts. Or was it? To this day, they are accredited with the world first on Lady Vash. However, they managed to achieve this task an entire month ahead of the next guild that got world second, a guild that we'll certainly talk about a lot as well, Method. It's normal once one guild fells an end boss for kills to gradually start rolling in the days or at latest the weeks to follow. This potential case of exploit early, exploit often had given the world's best guild a taste of victory, though possibly not through dev intended means. An article from 2007 sheds a little light on the subject, saying that the boss did not reset correctly when a paladin used divine intervention and they were able to finish it off. Few screenshots and no video footage remain that I can find of their kill, and when Method finally landed their first clear over 1 month later, miles ahead of any other guild, they claimed it world first legit. As for Kael'thas, he wasn't beaten until after patch 2.1, the Black Temple nerf patch for tier 5, nor was Vash for the vast majority of guilds. I think at some point Blizzard realized that the attunement chain they had set up required guilds to defeat the end bosses of tier 5 to progress, and seeing as how practically nobody had done that, that was going to be a bit of a problem moving into tier 6. Speaking of tier 6, Nihilum continued their path of dominance, setting foot in Hyjal and claiming the world first kill on Rage Winterchill. You must do this in order to enter Black Temple, and then going straight into that raid and landing each and every single world first kill on the entire raid. Illidan lived for a total of 21 days. And then after that, Nihilum went straight back to Hyjal and 4 days later claimed the world first for Archimonde. No questions remained. This was the greatest raiding guild of its era. Their run of performance seemed totally unconquerable. Also, it's worth a note that Black Temple was the first time ever for raiding where Blizzard decided to hold a PTR, something which top guilds very much took advantage of to get an edge over the competition. But TBC wasn't over yet. Sure, they had beaten the big bad guy on the cover of the box, but the next expansion still wasn't for over 1 year. Surely there had to be some more raid content to tie the top guilds over. Indeed there was. On 25th of March 2008, patch 2.4 and the Sunwell Plateau became available, along with a feature which is often forgotten about. Not all of the raid bosses were available on day 1. In fact, the latter half of the bosses were staggered week upon week, so top guilds were essentially stuck progress-wise even if they had the capability to clear the bosses. What the Sunwell is famously remembered for though is the Muru encounter, a room with a Naru who summons a lot of adds, and they have a lot of health and they do a lot of damage. If you fall behind on the adds, you wipe very fast. It was Muru that can be seen as the turning point for requiring min-max out of your raid comp, with drums of battle famously being stacked here to squeeze out every ounce of performance from your character. But for a change here in the race, and a wholly unexpected one, it would not be Nihilum to take the world first kill of Muru, or the final boss of the raid, Kil'jaeden. It was a roster formed as part of an esport team, the German-founded SK Gaming. Not a newcomer to Blizzard games by any stretch of the imagination, SK Gaming had a track record for producing winners in the Warcraft 3 scene, and were now trying their hand in Blizzard's MMO, producing teams for both arena and raiding content. Whilst the established guilds in the scene for WoW were known to be great, they were exactly that, guilds. SK Gaming showed for the first time the power of the organization over the guild, sweeping the top guild in the world and taking a surprise clear on the hardest content Blizzard had ever released. Kil'jaeden lived for 62 days total, though you may be interested to know he was only actually available for attempts for 4 days due to bosses being staggered. Nevertheless, he was banished back to the Nether and Azeroth was safe once again. However, the Sunwell would mark the end for both Nihilum and SK Gaming. It was a hard, grueling raid. Motivation ebbed among Nihilum, who had been pushing hard for the past 3 or 4 years, whilst SK Gaming didn't see a future in World of Warcraft PvE content as an esport, and moved back over to focusing in PvP. This led to a merger between the two raiding titans, combining the absolute best of the best, briefly known as 25th November, but later renaming to Insidia. Into the frozen land of Northrend, stakes were higher than ever. This was the peak of World of Warcraft subcount, and during this expansion, difficulty would spike considerably between achievements, hard mode, and finally heroic modes. This would separate the good from the great guilds. The mega merger of Insidia set out to do the business they'd been formed to do, getting all 15 world first kills in the Naxxramas remake 2 days after release, the world first of Malagos on the same day, and Sartharian 3 Drakes less than a week later, a statement opening tier. Ulduar in patch 3.1 dropped on the 14th of April 2009, giving us the only ever tier to have hard modes as the difficulty modifier. Ulduar featured 2 main challenges instead of your standard just go and kill all the bosses. Number 1 was defeating Algalon the Observer. This was a hard mode only boss that required you to have defeated all other encounters that had a hard mode and would despawn after 1 hour of combat. Number 2 was Yogg Zero Lights. This was defeating Yogg-Saron without any help from the Titan Keepers. This modification made the fight significantly harder. The race to Algalon was won by Insidia. He lived for a total of 50 days, though there is no shortage of accusations made amongst top guilds as to pretty much anything that could have in any way given another guild an advantage. Indeed, at the time some felt that Insidia, due to their legacy among raiding, were overlooked by Blizzard when taking advantage of actions which could very easily be considered exploits. One of many they took advantage of was their Hodir hard mode kill, where a number of mobs were dragged over from the Freya encounter that mages used to spell steal a buff called Flower Power from. This increased their damage by 25% and stacked up to 10 times. This meant the 5 mages they brought along were doing 250% bonus damage, and they could cheese the hard mode on the encounter. But hey, that was what you had to do at the time. Other guilds could have figured it out, so they have to if they want the world first, right? This is the mentality that prevailed at the time. Yogg Zero Lights was also not without drama. A guild, Exodus, found a way to bug out the final phase of the fight so that the ads that spawned had no effect. They said, the bug is when somebody is left inside the brain room of Yogg-Saron, they can still get aggro on the ads that spawn in phase 3. This means if you have somebody getting healing aggro in the brain room, they will get aggro on the ads, which cause them to evade in place and allows for all of your raid's DPS to be focused on Yogg. Nevertheless, they pushed on and even recorded the kill, afterwards reporting the severe bug that they had found. So what did Blizzard do other than ban them for 72 hours, remove the world first credit, titles, and loot? One member, K Warrior from Exodus, confirmed the suspension following the exploit, but also asked for a bit more accountability from Blizzard towards Insidia and their not too shiny track record. It would not take long for this to come true. As for Zero Lights, Insidia could not crack it with their roster, and a complete surprise came from a Taiwanese guild, Stars. The difference maker was the comp that they had access to. Part of the Zero Lights encounter has a mechanic where you cannot face the boss. Warlock's Drained Soul at the time was an extremely powerful execute ability that could be channeled with your back to the boss, which made them invaluable on the most important part of the fight. Yogg Zero Lights took 85 days to vanquish. Patch 3.2 led us onto one of World of Warcraft's less memorable raids, Trial of the Grand Crusader, the first tier to feature heroic raiding as a toggle outside of the instance, and the second tier in a row for an upset for the world first race. Insidia at the time claimed they were going for achievements rather than the actual first heroic kill. Regardless, another European guild rose here to prominence and began their era of dominance. Aragon, an entirely Finnish-speaking guild who pulled off some of the most impressive world firsts we have ever seen. With the grand finale of Wrath of the Lich King looming, it was looking like a 2-horse race between the recently deposed Insidia and Paragon. But the opening of Icecrown Citadel would see one of the biggest dramas in competitive raiding ever, and the end of an era for a legend. Exodus's foreshadowing of Blizzard holding Insidia accountable had come around, and their time of reckoning was upon them. At the time, a clear on normal mode was required to access heroic, so guilds were looking to get the content clear as soon as possible. The race was truly on, and it was Insidia's world first Lich King 25 normal that led to their downfall. One exploit too far. This boss was just too big to Blizzard, and they could not ignore what had been done. The cause? Bombs. Saronite bombs. They somehow rebuilt the platform when they detonated. In a statement, Blizzard said the siege damage of the bombs was causing the Frozen Throne platform to rebuild, which greatly decreases the difficulty of the encounter, and in the hours to follow, Blizzard would issue both a hotfix to the encounter as well as a 72-hour suspension for members of Insidia. Opinions on this ban have gone back and forth so much. From rogues use bombs as part of their rotation, they didn't intend it, to it's about time Insidia were banned for using an exploit. Nevertheless, it was a full house of Finns that led their way to the world first Lich King Heroic 25 kill. On 26th of March 2010, 46 days after Heroic mode was made available, Arthas fell with arguably one of the most famous moments in WoW raiding history. In December of 2010, the Cataclysm struck, changing Azeroth forever and uncovering new zones that had been shrouded in mystery for so long. Hyjal, Uldum, and Vashir. And with this, raiding changed once again. Now 10 and 25 man had equal rewards, though 25 man got more drops. Also, the attempt system of previous tiers had gone. World first, raiders didn't know at the time, but the opening tier was going to be absolutely brutal. Tier 11 featured Blackwing Descent with a return from both Onyxia and Nefarian, Bastion of Twilight with Cho'Gall and the secret hidden heroic boss Sinestra, and Throne of the Four Winds, where we fought our first elemental lord of the expansion. The White Death, known as Paragon, washed over this entire tier, though Method were very much on their heels for the majority of it. Paragon opened Cataclysm with a trio of world first, Nefarian falling in 27 days, Bastion of Twilight in 38 days, and Al-Akir in 42 days. In the words of a Paragon Raider Zin, all in all, this tier of raiding in my opinion has been the hardest tier of raiding overall. There haven't been many pushover bosses on heroic difficulty, there hasn't been any time gating, and there hasn't been any achievements and such. It's just been one big, absolutely brutal grind. Secret boss Sinestra was nearly a source of drama as it hadn't been fully tested, and Blizzard were live hotfixing it during attempts, which made strategizing against it frustrating. And this wouldn't be the last time a boss was A, not tested, and then B, basically live tested by the world first raiders. Din also commented that you could literally hit the boss for over 1 billion damage with a single GCD. It was pretty scary watching Sinestra almost die by accident. Luckily it didn't come to this, and they claimed a kill as Blizzard intended in the end. The first major content patch for the Cataclysm dropped on June 28th. A summer release for the Firelands was all too fitting. This raid would see some very cool encounter design from the likes of Alis Resort, and our second encounter with the Elemental Lord of Fire, Ragnaros, except this time he's grown some legs. Paragon got an esports sponsor as well, now changing their name to Dream Paragon, and they would prove their worth in the Firelands. The revisit from Rag made many of the legendary boss lists of World of Warcraft look like absolute jokes. This fight was 16 minutes of absolute perfection, yet once again the Finns conquered the flame. Despite the sheer difficulty and having done over 500 pulls, Ragnaros Revisited fell 14 days from release. The follow-up raid to the Firelands is steeped in controversy among World of Warcraft fans. The birth of LFR, a tier that lasted 10 months with no new content, and a disappointing conclusion to the expansion. It also subverted the expectations of the players following the World First race, but not in the ways that you would want. With LFR being a brand new system, I suppose it shouldn't have been a surprise that it did have its problems, but it was LFR abuse that caused many top guilds to land themselves with an 8-day ban on the eve of heroic mode releasing, effectively giving themselves a little to no chance to compete. Both Method and Paragon were slapped with the ban hammer for exploiting here. Here's an explanation of what exactly went down from Paragon. We found out that you can loot past loot on bosses regardless of save status if you zone out and back into the instance. This did not provide the raid with any extra loot, but it did eliminate a major portion of the RNG that would have been involved involved in simply doing personal runs for everybody. And despite it being LFR gear, the Dragon Soul Tank Tier 4 set had exceptionally powerful bonuses that could function as raid-wide cooldowns. These, among other items, were very desirable for heroic progression as tools for the top guilds. However, kin raiders from Korea stepped up and claimed the world first kill on the Spine of Deathwing, and would go on to defeat the Madness of Deathwing 2. In fact, many players at the time believed Spine to be the more difficult fight due to the extremely high burst DPS requirements. Deathwing lived for 14 days. The next expansion was considered a bit of an out-of-season April Fool's joke by many, yet contained some of the most loved raids and encounters. Our next journey takes us to a faraway land, where we're going to be fighting bugs that choose, most scarily of all, emotions. Paragon took a raid downsize moving into Mists of Pandaria, and whilst they completely dominated the 10-man heroic scene, as mentioned at the start, the focus here is on 25. At the time, some of their raiders seeking to push looked to another EU guild that had steadily been on the rise, without question the most recognisable guild name ever, and a team that is still going today, Method. North American guild Blood Legion also proved highly competent during the era of Mists of Pandaria as well. The opening tiers of MOP had a staggered release. Mogashan Vaults was first, with Will of the Emperors dropping 3 days after it was out. Method claimed that one. Heart of Fear was next, another short race, Blood Legion taking a point for NA here. Empress Shek'Zia dropped on day 5. Terrace of the Endless Springs was the last for the opening tier, the final boss of the raid being the Shah of Fear. Despite it being one of the longest and most complicated boss encounters in recent memory, their first kill being a grueling 24-minute slugfest. Patch 5.1 opened on March 5th, 2013, the Throne of Thunder, a raid that players look back to as a crowning jewel on how damn good raiding can be when it's good. As with previous tiers, North American guild Blood Legion provided a competitor for Method. The boys from across the pond were starting to show signs of life after a stint of EU dominance in the raiding scene ever since AQ40. Nevertheless, Method at this point were really on a different level, going from strength to strength, earning their world first kill of Lei Shen heroic 25-man. This also unlocked the second secret-only heroic boss since Sinestra, the enslaved titan from whom Lei Shen had stolen his power, Raden. Unfortunately, just like Sinestra, the fight was buggy and it was undertuned, leading to a somewhat forgettable end of an otherwise fantastic tier. The Thunder King's reign lasted 14 days. Mists of Pandaria culminated with the heroes of Azeroth joining forces to storm the gates of Orgrimmar and put an end to the tyrannical reign of Garrosh Hellscream, who totally did nothing wrong. Siege of Orgrimmar was a marathon of a raid featuring 14 bosses total, only one less than Naxxramas, although the majority fell within the first 2 days, and similar to Throne of Thunder, Blood Legion were on the heels of Method and indeed led the race early on. But Method cracking some of the tougher encounters earlier, such as Siegecrafter Blackfuse, gave them the extra time they needed on Garrosh. A 15-minute highly complex encounter where a lone paladin landed the final blow in their bubble. Garrosh lived for 14 days. We're seeing a lot of 14 days, aren't we, actually, for the world first kills. Wondering why? Well, it's reset day for the instance, and these kills usually blast back through the reclear, and the extra gear helps them get over the line just barely. Siege of Orgrimmar was a raid I enjoyed a lot personally as well. The one criticism, well, it opened on the 10th of September 2013. The next expansion wouldn't drop until the 13th of November 2014. That's a long time. I really hope it's worth the wait. through the Dark Portal again then, but this time in the past? I'm confused. Time traveling orcs or something. Back to a blast from the past in Warlords of Draenor, we would see an uncorrupted Outland and face a whole new series of challenges, more commonly known at the time as the second Orc expansion in a row. It had a lot to live up to, and raiding wise, many would agree it did. Warlords of Draenor was the first expansion where the newly introduced 20-man mythic mode would be used from the start to the end, a format which has stuck to this day. The opening tier was Highmaul, and for this raid, the Finns made their triumphant return to 20-man raiding. After a dominant show in the 10-man scene of Mists of Pandaria, Paragon were back to the big leagues. And as they tended to do, they tipped the scales and got the world first of Imperator Margok. Overall though, the Highmaul world first race was a short one. Imperator lived for 4 days. The next tier, a mere 2 months later, was Black Rock Foundry, a raid with some of the most brilliant and just plain fun boss designs to ever have been put in the game. Hans and Franz with their slammers and pop-tarts, Operator Thogar aka the Train Boss, and Blackhand with his multi-floor encounter. Blackrock Foundry would be the final tier for NA's hopeful Blood Legion, as they once again fell short on a world first, though Midwinter gave Method a run for their money. But again, it was Method that landed the first kill. Blackhand lived for a total of 10 days. And at this point, things were not overly looking good for Warlords of Draenor here. There was a doubt that Blizzard even had another raid to pull out of the bag. They did though, Hellfire Citadel. This would be one of the hardest raid tiers in a very long time, and it all came down to the last boss, though the raid was packed with big lore names in WoW that we finally got to fight, such as Kil'jaeden, Deadeye, Gorefiend, Manaroth, but all of them fell over in the space of a week or so. Our second encounter with Archimonde since TBC was going to be quite a bit harder. Revamped Archimonde was one of the most mechanically demanding fights in a long time, and he lived for 16 days total. Warlords of Draenor, whilst having the challenge for raiders, had been a low point for many other players. Hopes were high heading into the next expansion, and with a return from Illidan Stormrage, the Demon Hunter class, and DPS meters about to go into their millions, how could it ever go wrong? Legion would prove to be arguably the most hardcore expansion there has ever been in WoW for the world first raiders. Between the legendary RNG, split raiding, this would be the last expansion to have master looting, grinding your AP, and maintaining all of this on multiple characters, the burnout was fierce among the top end players. The first tier of the expansion was the Emerald Nightmare. Surely this was going to be, wait, it was really undertuned. Or maybe the players were overtuned. One way or another, this opening tier missed the mark for difficulty hard, and was cleared within 18 hours of launch by Russian guild Exorcus. You could say Xavius surrendered to madness. A mini-raid was added to tie over before the next big tier, and it was much more difficult than anything we had seen in the Emerald Nightmare. This was the Trial of Valor, and for the first time in a long old while, a title was added for not having died during the raid, the Chosen, though it was tracked on an individual player basis, not for the entire raid as it had been during Wrath of the Lich King for the Undying and other similar achievements. Hellier would live for 3 days, as Method claimed another world first. The following raid was the Nighthold, the seat of the Nightborn's power, the font of night, and just lots of night stuff really. This raid would prove a 3-horse race between Method, Exorcus, and Serenity. Now Serenity had been formed sometime earlier with the goal of landing their own world first, and Legion wasn't the easiest expansion they could have set themselves that goal in. In the end, for the Nighthold, the Russians took their second world first of the expansion, showing the Emerald Nightmare was not just a stroke of luck. In the next 2 days, both Serenity and Method would also land their kills. This will be the last world first race for Serenity though, as a number of their members left to join Method, and the chance of a world first in the future slipped away. Exorcus took 11 days and 248 attempts to clear the Nighthold. The next tier would test the skill and patience of even the best guild. That was the Tomb of Sargeras. Now, throughout our world first journey, there have been many excessively difficult encounters. Heroic Rag, Mythic Archimonde, but what would await the best guilds in Tomb of Sargeras was something even beyond that. In fact, at the start of the tier, Tomb of Sargeras was looking as though it was going to fall over in no time at all. And then guilds started getting to Fallen Avatar, a 2-part fight where you decided when the boss boss would be phased based on its energy bar or its remaining health, followed by a phase 2 DPS race, where Method barely managed to get the kill before the next mechanic would have wiped out the raid. The final fight in the Tomb of Sargeras was a second encounter against Kil'jaeden, and this would prove just more than a little more difficult than what SK Gaming had to deal with in the Sunwell. This encounter was brutally difficult and had mechanics that certain race class combos literally could not live through. Shamans and priests were forced to race change to Goblin for the rocket boost ratio that could be used to overcome a series of knockbacks. This entire encounter was 15 minutes of perfection of dealing with soaks, overlaps and flawless execution, and after 19 days and 654 wipes, Method were free from the spaceship prison and had beat the Tomb of Sargeras. The ending cinematic of this instance would set the scene for our next journey to another planet, to the home of the Legion, Argus. The final raid of this epic expansion would see the heroes of Azeroth finally take the fight to the Legion and destroy the corrupted world soul that sustained them. Though it was another relatively short raid overall, 10 out of 11 bosses were defeated by the second day of the raid opening, and from near the start it was looking as though a two-guild race between US hopeful Limit and Europe's Method. Yet in another display of skill, after 8 days and 320 wipes, Method once again won the race without drama. Legion had been hard on the top guilds, a lot of grind, very difficult end bosses, and lots of RNG on gearing. The next expansion though, whilst not loved by many, would see massive changes in the high-end raiding scene and a total redesign of how the race was to be followed worldwide. For the first time in literally the history of raiding, the curtain would be pulled aside. Viewers would get a real look into exactly what went into World First raiding, the tactics, the comp changes, the wiping, the progress, the hours they pulled, day over sometimes week at a time. Spearheaded by Method, who had decided to stream their entire World First progression, this would bring an entire new level of hype to the event. No longer was it speculations on forums, rumors, and eagerly refreshing Warcraft log pages to see if a kill had been landed. Now you got it in real time. Many guilds would go on to follow this example, and today World First raiding has entirely changed because of this initiative. Whilst guilds now get to actively watch other attempts and learn from their mistakes, it makes it a much more compelling event, not to mention a much more solid earner for the organizations as well, which can keep them going strong. The opening tier for battle for Azeroth was Uldir, a Titan facility reminiscent of Ulduar, though not quite so fondly remembered or looked back upon. In the end, Method's method prevailed, another world first for them. G'huun fell on day 8, after 285 pulls. The battle for Dazara Lore would follow, an interesting raid format where Horde and Alliance would briefly play as the opposite faction to see the story of the raid through their eyes. Similar to Uldir though, Limit was once again proving stiff competition for Method, but the last boss, Jaina Proudmoore, would be the real challenge. A race that only lasted one reset but coming down to the wire, and despite Limit getting there first, Method were able to perfect the tactics and take down the encounter in 7 days and 346 wipes. And then we had the Crucible of Storms, another mini raid like the Trial of Valor. As it turned out, so this would be one of the most difficult raids in a very long time, despite only having 2 bosses. And for a change, a different European guild, Pieces, would land the world first kill. Crucible of Storms in the end lasted 9 days and 700 pulls, until Pieces took down Unat. The next raid featured a zone and a boss who could have held up an entire expansion, but this was to be it unfortunately. Najtar and Ashara's Eternal Palace. Another relatively straightforward raid until the end boss again, Queen Ashara herself. The televised nature of the raid lended itself to how incredibly close pulls were going back and forth between Limit and Method. Side by side they were getting ever closer to a kill percentage by percentage, but it was Method again that claimed the throne for themselves, defeating the Queen after 12 days and 359 pulls. The final raid of the roller coaster of BFA saw another setting you could have arguably put put a whole expansion on, Nihilo for the Waking City. And for the first time in 8 years, North America took a world first. The last one was Heart of Fear and Mr. Pandaria. Yes, that was 8 years before BFA. Feel old yet. Limit took an early lead in the race and never let it go. The old god N'Zoth was a disappointing conclusion to an expansion many players would rather forget. He lived 10 days and endured 270 wipes, but Method's loss of the world first tier wouldn't be the thing that would nearly have the organization fall apart. Something much worse had now been allowed to fester for far too long. In June 2020, a twitlonger was sent out alleging sexual misconduct from a prominent member of Method's raiding core and stream team, Method Josh. It was later found that Method had ample evidence of the ongoings but overlooked their importance and failed to act upon them. During the time in which the scandal unfolded, Method lost nearly everything. Sponsors left them, raiders sought out other teams, streamers quit the org, and leadership at the once world-first guild went quiet for a period of several months. From the outside, it looked as though this would be it for Method. In time, though, they would restructure, reevaluate, and be able to rebuild what was a fragmented organization, because the next expansion was quickly approaching. With Method in turmoil, Limit seemingly had no competition left, and a world-first run seemed assured for the North American powerhouse. Yet in the wake Method had left behind, another European guild had risen, Echo. This new squad was many of the ex-Method members who still sought to push performance in World of Warcraft raiding on a world-class level, and the opening raid of Shadowlands would be their proving grounds. In the end though, Limit would claim a back-to-back end-to-start of expansion win for North America, taking out Sire Denathrius on day 8 after 143 pulls. Echo would land a close second, and a reformed Method would land 5th. The second tier of Shadowlands was the Sanctum of Domination, where we finally actually get to fight Sylvanas Windrunner, which for such a big lore character ended up being a kinda, well, not the most epic encounter we could have envisioned, put it like that. However, here EU were back with a vengeance as Echo burst onto the world first scene, taking the world first on day 7 after 169 pulls. It had been a short-lived reign for NA, yet the race between the two was still very close. Patch 9.2 saw the final major content patch of the Shadowlands and the final tier we will cover in this video, the Sepulchre of the First Ones. This raid saw a return of tier sets to World of Warcraft and an insane difficulty wall for the top end guilds, with many being stuck on a mid-raid boss for several days. Much like the past two tiers, it had appeared to be a race between North America hopeful Limit, who have now joined an org and changed their name to Liquid, and Europe's Echo. And as we've seen so far, it takes something special for an end boss to make it past day 14, and the Jailer would be one to join that group. Echo once again proves their worth on a back-to-back world-first victory, felling Zovaal on day 18 after 227 pulls. That's the same number of days as Archimonde Mythic was in Warlords of Draenor, and one less than Mythic Kil'jaeden in Legion. Suffice to say, this was not a pushover tier. Equally remarkable was Method scoring world second after Limit called it due to burnout among players. At the same time, somewhat of a bittersweet claim for Method, as the Jailer bugged in the final phase and did not heal as much as he was supposed to. Nevertheless, the kill stands and Blizzard have just hotfixed it moving forwards. To be in contention for world second all the same considering what happens shows the organisation that still has a lot of talent. Which brings us all the way up to date. We don't even know what the next expansion is as of this video releasing. All we do know is it's going to be announced April 19th. You can really tell how the world first race has changed over the years and how much more competitive the scene has grown. The tuning for content Blizzard is throwing at the best raiders in modern World of Warcraft is crazy difficult, and I think you can see a turning point when Paragon began to demolish the competition back in Wrath of the Lich King to early Cataclysm, where even exceptionally difficult bosses were barely making it to the second reset. We will have to see whether Blizzard considers the difficulty of the Sepulchre of the First Ones as a new benchmark, or whether it's just the last raid of the expansion. Let's give people something to bash their heads against for a good while. I can only imagine how many times the content will be nerfed to be actually reasonable for the average cutting edge guild, or maybe the extra tier and legendaries will do the job instead. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. I don't do these mega videos videos too often, and this is the longest one I've ever done, I'm pretty sure, since it's just not a very sensible way to put out content like this when doing YouTube. Unfortunately, this site really likes quantity over quality for the most part, but this topic and how much there is to it felt special to me, so I did it the way I wanted to. Liking the video if you did and subscribing will help get the video out there, and hopefully if another topic comes by like this, I can really give it the time that it deserves. Let's hope whatever expansion comes next gives us many more entertaining and close world first races to follow. That is everything though. As always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.